In Willowbrook Manor's dining room, an 85-year-old woman was about to witness her family's ultimate betrayal. What started as a birthday celebration took a shocking turn when they discussed stripping away her legal rights. Margaret Sullivan wasn't your typical dementia patient. For 18 months, she had been secretly lucid, known for her strategic mind and business acumen. When she encountered her son David, planning to steal her fortune, she had no idea she was walking into a web of deception. Margaret's performance would lead to a dangerous game of survival. What began as family duty would become war. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Sullivan sat in her wheelchair beside the tall windows of Willowbrook Manor's main dining room, her hands folded in her lap with the careful positioning of someone who had forgotten how to use them properly. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished hardwood floors, and somewhere behind her clouded expression, she catalogued every word, every glance, every cruel assumption her family made about her condition. "Happy birthday, Mother!" David's voice carried the hollow cheerfulness of obligation as he placed a wrapped box in her lap. The gift felt light. Probably a scarf or some other meaningless token that said, "I remembered," without requiring actual thought. Margaret let her eyes drift toward the box without focus, maintaining the vacant stare that had protected her for 18 months. Inside her mind, sharp as the day she'd built Sullivan Industries into a $50 million empire, she noted how David's hands shook slightly. Withdrawal from whatever vice was consuming his life this week, or simply the tremors of desperation. "She won't remember this tomorrow." Jennifer's voice drifted from across the room, speaking to her husband Michael with the casual cruelty of someone who believed her words had no audience. "But we have to keep up appearances." Appearances. Margaret's internal voice carried decades of boardroom steel. "Is that what I've become to them? An appearance to maintain?" The party continued around her like a poorly rehearsed play. David's wife Linda busied herself arranging flowers that would be thrown away within days. Their son Tommy, her grandson, sat in a corner chair, his 16-year-old eyes studying his grandmother with an uncomfortable intensity that Margaret found both touching and dangerous. "The papers are ready," David murmured to Jennifer as they moved closer to Margaret's wheelchair. To them, she was furniture now, present but irrelevant to conversations about her own fate. Harrison confirmed the diagnosis last month: progressive cognitive decline. "The lawyer says we can move forward with guardianship proceedings." Margaret's fingers twitched slightly against the gift box, but she caught herself. Months of practice had taught her the precise limits of acceptable movement for someone in her supposed condition. She'd studied dementia symptoms with the same methodical approach she'd once used to analyze market trends. Jennifer's voice carried guilt beneath its resignation. "Are we sure this is necessary? She seems... I don't know, sometimes when I look at her..." "She's gone, Jen." David's interruption was sharp enough to cut through any second thoughts his sister might harbor. "You saw what happened when she tried to help Mrs. Patterson find her room last week. Wandering the halls at 3 in the morning, confused and agitated. She's a danger to herself and others. Mrs. Patterson." Margaret remembered that night clearly. The elderly woman had been genuinely lost and frightened, calling for her long-dead husband in the darkened hallway. Margaret had guided her back to her room, speaking softly until the woman calmed. But David had arrived just as Margaret was returning to her own room, and she'd had to quickly slip back into her vacant persona. His conclusion that she'd been the one wandering confused had been exactly what she'd expected. The lawyer, a thin man with expensive clothes and cheap ethics, approached their cluster. Margaret recognized him from previous visits, though she'd never been formally introduced. William Forrester, according to the business card she'd glimpsed. Specialized in estate planning and elder law. "Mr. Sullivan," Forrester's voice was professionally neutral. "The power of attorney documents are prepared. Once your mother signs them, you'll have complete authority over her financial affairs and medical decisions." Margaret watched from behind her mask as Forrester produced a leather folder containing documents that would effectively erase her legal existence. 40 years of building a business, of making decisions that employed hundreds of people, reduced to incompetent signatures on papers she wasn't supposed to understand. David's phone buzzed against his jacket. His face tightened as he glanced at the screen, and Margaret caught the slight pallor that suggested bad news. Money troubles, most likely. Her son had always been better at spending than earning. "I need to take this." David stepped toward the windows, lowering his voice but not enough. "Yes, I understand the timeline. Next week. I'm working on accessing additional funds." Additional funds. The phrase settled in Margaret's mind like ice. Her trust fund, the one she'd established to provide for her family's future, had become David's immediate solution to whatever hole he'd dug himself into. Elena Vasquez appeared at Margaret's elbow with the quiet efficiency that marked her as one of the facility's better nurses. "Time for your afternoon medication, Mrs. Sullivan." Margaret allowed Elena to help her with the pills, noting how the nurse's eyes swept the room with subtle observation. Elena had been working the evening and night shifts for 3 months now, and Margaret had begun to sense something different about her attention. Not the patronizing oversight of most staff, but something sharper, more aware. "Such a lovely party," Elena commented to the room in general, her slight accent lending warmth to words that carried undertones Margaret found intriguing. "Mrs. Sullivan is fortunate to have such a devoted family." The comment landed with perfect innocence, but Margaret caught the slight emphasis on, quote, devoted. Elena's gaze lingered on David as he concluded his phone call with obvious agitation. Tommy rose from his corner chair and approached Margaret's wheelchair. Unlike the adults, he knelt beside her so their eyes were level, a gesture of respect the others hadn't considered. "Hey, Grandma." His voice carried genuine affection. "I brought you something I made in shop class. It's not much, but—" He placed a small wooden box in her hands, his fingers warm against hers. The craftsmanship was careful and precise, the wood smooth with careful sanding. Margaret's heart constricted at the obvious love invested in its creation. "Tommy, don't overwhelm her." David's voice carried irritation as he rejoined the group. "She doesn't really understand." "She understands more than you think." Tommy's interruption surprised everyone, including Margaret. "Sometimes when I talk to her alone, I swear that's enough." David's tone brooked no argument. "Your grandmother is ill. These moments you think you're seeing, that's just wishful thinking." Margaret watched her grandson's face close down, the hurt and confusion carefully hidden behind a teenager's practiced indifference. But she'd seen the spark of suspicion in his eyes, the intelligence that reminded her painfully of herself at his age. The afternoon wound down with the mechanical efficiency of duty fulfilled. Gifts were opened with appropriate exclamations over Margaret's supposed delight. Photos were taken with everyone smiling at the camera, while Margaret maintained her distant gaze. Conversations continued around her as if she were already gone. As the family prepared to leave, Jennifer lingered beside Margaret's chair. "I love you, Mom," she whispered, and Margaret heard real pain in her daughter's voice. I hope you know that, somewhere inside." "I know," Margaret thought, "but do you know what you're allowing to happen to me?" The door closed behind the last visitor, and the room settled into evening quiet. Elena began clearing away the party debris with efficient movements, but Margaret noticed how she paused near the spot where David and the lawyer had stood, her eyes taking in details with professional interest. "Long day, Mrs. Sullivan." Elena's voice was gentle as she adjusted Margaret's wheelchair position. "Big celebrations can be tiring." Margaret maintained her vacant expression, but something in Elena's tone suggested layers beneath the surface kindness. The nurse's hands were steady and sure, as she checked Margaret's comfort, but her eyes held questions that Margaret found both hopeful and terrifying. As Elena prepared to wheel her back to her room, Margaret caught sight of Tommy through the window. He stood beside his father's car, his body language tense with argument. David's gestures were sharp with anger, and Margaret could almost hear his words through the glass. "Stop asking questions. Stop making things complicated." The gift box from Tommy remained in Margaret's lap, its smooth wood warm from her touch. Inside her carefully constructed facade, Margaret Sullivan, former CEO, mother, grandmother, and now invisible prisoner of her own deception, began to understand that her performance was reaching its limits. The birthday party was over, but the real drama was just beginning. And somewhere in the careful balance between safety and dignity, Margaret would have to decide whether remaining invisible was worth the price of her soul. The quiet hours after 10:30 brought Willowbrook Manor its deepest peace, and Margaret Sullivan waited for this silence like a prisoner waits for darkness. Elena's footsteps had faded down the hallway 20 minutes ago, completing the evening rounds with her characteristic efficiency. The birthday decorations still hung in the common areas, their cheerful colors now seeming grotesque in the dim emergency lighting. Margaret's fingers found the hidden catch beneath her wheelchair's armrest with practiced precision. The small compartment opened soundlessly, revealing what her family would never expect to find: a digital recorder no larger than a matchbox, a collection of photographs, and a leather-bound notebook filled with her careful handwriting. For 18 months, she had been documenting their betrayal. The recorder felt warm in her palm as she activated it, scrolling through the files with the same methodical approach she'd once used to review quarterly reports. David's voice emerged from the tiny speaker, captured 3 weeks ago during what he'd believed was a private conversation with Jennifer. "The trust fund is worth $12 million now." His recorded voice carried the greedy satisfaction Margaret remembered from his childhood when he'd counted birthday money. "Once we have guardianship, I can access the principal, not just the interest payments she's been living on." Margaret's jaw tightened as she listened to her son discuss her fortune as if she were already dead. The recording continued with Jennifer's hesitant voice. "But what if she recovers? People do sometimes." "She's not recovering, Jen. Look at her. She can barely remember her own name half the time." "Half the time." Margaret's internal voice carried bitter amusement. She remembered everything, including the moment 18 months ago when this nightmare had begun. The memories surfaced with painful clarity. She'd been recovering from a minor fall in her own home, temporarily using a walker, when she'd overheard David on her kitchen phone. His back had been to her as he spoke in the low, urgent tones of desperation. "She's becoming a problem, Linda. All this independence bullshit. She needs professional care, and I need access to those accounts. The Meridian Group is pressing for payment, and if I don't come up with $2 million by Christmas..." Margaret had frozen in her hallway, invisible in her own home as her son discussed managing her situation. The Meridian Group. She'd recognized the name from business journals. High-stakes poker games, loan sharks who catered to wealthy addicts. David's gambling had progressed beyond anything she'd imagined. "The assisted living facility will provide documentation of her decline," David had continued. "Dr. Wright already thinks she's showing early signs. A few months of the right medications, maybe some confusion about her surroundings, and we'll have all the medical evidence we need for incompetency proceedings." That had been the moment Margaret Sullivan, CEO and mother, had died. In her place had been born Margaret Sullivan, confused elderly woman whose mind was slipping away from her family's unfortunate but necessary interventions. The transition had required every ounce of strategic thinking she'd honed during 40 years of business negotiations. She'd researched dementia symptoms with the same thorough approach she'd once used to analyze market competitors. The vacant stare, the occasional moments of apparent recognition followed by confusion, the gradual loss of basic skills, all carefully choreographed to match David's timeline for her decline. Moving to Willowbrook Manor had been presented as her idea, a decision made during one of her lucid moments when she'd expressed concern about living alone. David had been so pleased with her apparent cooperation that he'd missed the calculation behind her compliance. Margaret turned to a new recording, this one from just 2 hours ago. David's conversation with the lawyer echoed in the small device. "The power of attorney will give me immediate control. Once that's signed, I can start liquidating assets to cover the business expenses." Business expenses. Margaret's fortune, built through decades of careful investment and strategic growth, reduced to covering her son's gambling debts. She opened the leather notebook, its pages filled with dates, times, and detailed observations. Every visitor, every conversation, every moment when her family's true intentions had shown through their performance of care. The handwriting was steady and precise, hardly the scrawl of someone suffering cognitive decline. November 15th. David arrived agitated, took phone call in hallway. Overheard. I told you the money will be available next month. The legal proceedings are moving forward. Hands shaking, pupils dilated. Possible cocaine use. December 3rd. Jennifer brought Christmas decorations, seemed genuinely emotional. Asked staff about my condition. Expressed doubt about diagnosis to Linda. David interrupted conversation quickly. Jennifer may be salvageable. January 22nd. Tommy spent 2 hours reading to me. Asked several questions about my business background that showed sophisticated understanding. Said his history teacher mentioned Sullivan Industries. Dangerous. His intelligence could expose the performance, but his affection appears genuine. Margaret closed the notebook and retrieved the photographs. Most had been taken with a small camera Elena had unknowingly helped position during routine room cleaning. The images showed David rifling through Margaret's personal papers, the lawyer's documents spread across her bedside table, and most damning, a series of photos showing David pocketing jewelry from her collection during his visits. The evidence was comprehensive, damaging, and completely useless without someone to present it. A soft knock interrupted her documentation review. Margaret quickly secured the materials in their hiding place and resumed her vacant posture as the door opened quietly. Elena entered with the measured steps of someone trying not to wake a sleeping patient, but her eyes immediately found Margaret's. For a moment that stretched longer than it should have, the two women studied each other in the dim light. "Mrs. Sullivan?" Elena's voice was barely above a whisper. "I thought I heard. Are you having trouble sleeping?" Margaret maintained her blank expression, but something in Elena's tone suggested the question carried more weight than simple concern for insomnia. The nurse moved closer, her professional mask slipping slightly to reveal something that looked like suspicion mixed with hope. "I've been working with elderly patients for 15 years, Elena continued, ostensibly adjusting Margaret's blankets but actually positioning herself for quiet conversation. "I've seen real dementia progression, and I've seen families who—" she paused, choosing her words carefully, "who sometimes have their own interests in mind." Margaret's heart began to race, but she forced herself to maintain the performance. Elena's words could be a trap. David might have instructed staff to test her responses, but something in the nurse's manner suggested otherwise. Elena's next words were barely audible. "If someone were aware, but in danger, they might need an ally. Someone who understands how these situations work." The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and dangerous possibilities. Margaret found herself at a crossroads she'd been dreading, the moment when her carefully maintained isolation might need to crack to let in the possibility of help. Elena straightened, her professional demeanor returning as she made a show of checking Margaret's water glass and adjusting the room's temperature. But before leaving, she paused at the door. "I work the night shift most evenings," she said in normal tones that could be overheard by anyone. "If you need anything at all, just press your call button. Some things are easier to handle when there are fewer people around." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Margaret alone with a decision that could either save her or destroy the careful construction that had kept her alive for 18 months. Outside her window, the grounds of Willowbrook Manor stretched into darkness. Somewhere beyond the manicured landscaping, her family was returning to their lives, comfortable in their certainty that Margaret Sullivan was no longer a factor in their plans. They had no idea that behind her vacant stare, she was planning her own form of justice. The only question now was whether she was brave enough to trust someone else with her secret, or if the price of remaining invisible had finally become higher than the risk of being seen. Margaret returned the hidden materials to their compartment and settled back into her wheelchair. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations to monitor, and new evidence to gather. But tonight, for the first time in 18 months, she wasn't entirely alone with her knowledge. Elena Vasquez might be the ally she desperately needed, or the mistake that would destroy everything. Either way, Margaret Sullivan was about to discover that even the most carefully constructed performances eventually demand an audience. Elena's words from the night before echoed in Margaret's mind as morning light filtered through the lace curtains of her room. "Some things are easier to handle when there are fewer people around." The phrase carried weight that settled in Margaret's chest like a stone, heavy with possibility and danger in equal measure. The day shift brought its usual parade of cheerful incompetence. Margaret endured the morning routine with practiced patience, allowing herself to be dressed and positioned in her wheelchair like a mannequin. But her eyes tracked every movement, cataloging which staff members truly observed their patients, and which ones simply went through the motions. By 10:30, Margaret had been wheeled to the common area for what the staff called socialization time. The phrase always struck her as particularly cruel, a gathering of the forgotten, where conversation was either impossible or ignored. She sat near the large windows overlooking the garden, maintaining her vacant stare while internally reviewing Elena's carefully chosen words. If someone were aware, but in danger, the implication was clear. Elena suspected the truth, or at least suspected enough to extend what might be an offer of alliance. But Margaret had spent 18 months learning that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Even the most well-intentioned help could destroy everything if mishandled. "Beautiful morning, isn't it, Mrs. Sullivan?" Margaret turned her head slowly toward the voice, her movements deliberate and slightly confused as she'd trained herself to appear. Rose Chen sat in the adjacent chair, her posture erect despite her 79 years, her dark eyes sharp with an intelligence that reminded Margaret uncomfortably of herself. Rose had been observing her for weeks now, and Margaret had begun to suspect that her fellow resident was far more aware than she let on. Unlike most of the other residents who drifted through their days in medicated hazes, Rose maintained a clarity that felt almost aggressive in its refusal to fade. "I said it's a beautiful morning," Rose repeated, but her tone carried undertones that made Margaret's pulse quicken. "Though I suppose some mornings are more beautiful than others. Especially when you can actually see what's happening around you." Margaret's breathing remained steady, but internally, every alarm bell was ringing. Rose's words were too pointed, too specific to be accidental. Was this another test, or had she found a potential ally in the most unexpected place? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rose leaned slightly closer, her voice dropping to conversational levels that wouldn't carry beyond their immediate area. "I've been watching your family visits, dear. 40 years as a civil rights lawyer teaches you to recognize certain patterns. The way they talk around you, not to you. The documents that appear and disappear. The convenient timing of their concern for your welfare." Margaret's hands twitched slightly in her lap, a movement so small it could have been involuntary, but Rose's eyes caught it immediately. "I also notice how you position yourself during those visits," Rose continued with the relentless precision of a cross-examination. "Always where you can see and hear everything, never quite where they place you initially. Most people with genuine cognitive decline lose that kind of spatial awareness fairly early." She knows. The realization hit Margaret like ice water. Rose Chen, former civil rights attorney, had been conducting her own investigation and had reached the same conclusions that Elena was apparently approaching. Margaret forced herself to remain motionless as Rose reached into her sweater pocket and withdrew what appeared to be a small notebook, its pages filled with careful handwriting. "I've been documenting things too," Rose said quietly. "Times, dates, behaviors that don't match the supposed diagnosis. Your son's increasing desperation, the legal paperwork that keeps appearing, the way you respond to certain stimuli when you think no one's paying attention." The notebook lay open between them, and Margaret could see entries dated back months. Rose had been watching, recording, building a case with the methodical approach of someone who understood how evidence worked in the real world. "The question," Rose continued, "is whether you're going to maintain this performance until they succeed in stealing everything you've built, or if you're ready to fight back." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment she'd both hoped for and dreaded. The point where maintaining her cover became impossible if she wanted to survive what was coming. Rose represented exactly the kind of ally she needed. Legally trained, observant, and apparently committed to justice. But trusting anyone meant risking everything. Before Margaret could decide how to respond, David's voice cut through the morning quiet from across the room. He'd arrived earlier than usual, his face carrying the strain of whatever crisis was driving his accelerated timeline. "Mother!" His greeting was perfunctory as he approached, a manila envelope tucked under his arm. "I need you to sign some paperwork today. Just routine updates to your care plan." Margaret allowed her gaze to drift toward him with apparent confusion, but she noticed how Rose's posture shifted slightly, the subtle positioning of someone preparing to observe a performance. David pulled a chair close to Margaret's wheelchair, placing the envelope on the small side table. The facility needs updated authorization for your medications and treatments. Dr. Wright recommended some adjustments that require your consent. Lies. Margaret recognized the legal documents as power of attorney paperwork from their previous meeting, now dressed up in medical terminology to make them seem routine. David was accelerating his timeline, probably driven by whatever pressure the Meridian Group was applying. "Here, let me help you with the pen," David continued, his voice carrying the patronizing tone that made Margaret's skin crawl. "Just a few signatures, and we'll be done." Margaret let her hand shake slightly as David guided it toward the first signature line. She could feel Rose's attention like laser focus, watching every detail of this interaction, the weight of potential alliance pressed against her need for continued safety. That was when Elena appeared at Margaret's other side. "Mr. Sullivan," Elena's voice carried professional courtesy, with an undertone Margaret was learning to recognize as protective suspicion. "I don't see these documents on Mrs. Sullivan's daily care schedule. Usually we coordinate any paperwork requiring patients' signatures with the medical staff." David's jaw tightened, but his smile remained fixed. "These are routine family matters, not medical issues. My mother's perfectly capable of signing papers about her own care." "Of course," Elena agreed smoothly. "It's just that our protocols require witness signatures for any legal documents signed by residents. Patient protection policies, you understand?" Margaret watched David's frustration build as Elena positioned herself where she could clearly see both the documents and Margaret's responses. The nurse's intervention was expertly timed and professionally presented, but Margaret could see the calculation behind it. "I'll need to review these documents first," Elena continued, reaching for the envelope. "Standard procedure to ensure they don't conflict with any medical recommendations." "That won't be necessary," David's voice sharpened. "These are private family matters." Rose chose that moment to lean forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to legal proceedings. "Actually, I believe the nurse is correct. California law requires proper witnessing of signatures from residents in assisted living facilities, particularly when those residents have documented cognitive concerns." David's head snapped toward Rose, his eyes narrowing as he registered the precise legal language. "And you are?" "Rose Chen, retired attorney," Rose replied with a pleasant smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I specialized in elder law for the last 15 years of my practice. These protections exist for very good reasons." Margaret felt the power dynamic in the room shift dramatically. David found himself facing not just Elena's professional protocols, but Rose's legal expertise and knowledge of resident rights. His carefully planned ambush had become a confrontation with people who understood exactly what he was attempting. "Perhaps we should reschedule this," Elena suggested diplomatically. "Give everyone time to review the proper procedures." David's phone began buzzing insistently against his jacket. When he glanced at the screen, Margaret caught the flash of fear that crossed his face, the look of someone whose debts were calling in real time. "Fine," David snapped, shoving the documents back into their envelope. "But this needs to happen soon. Mother's condition is deteriorating, and these authorizations are necessary for her care." He leaned down to Margaret's eye level, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried threat, despite its gentle tone. "We'll try again tomorrow, Mother, when there are fewer interruptions." David strode away, his frustration evident in every line of his body. Margaret watched him leave, knowing that his desperation would only increase the danger in the coming days. Elena and Rose exchanged glances over Margaret's head, a look that spoke of shared suspicion and mutual respect. Margaret realized that whether she'd intended it or not, she'd just acquired two allies who were already coordinating their efforts to protect her. "Interesting morning," Rose commented casually as the tension in the room dissipated. "Some people seem to think legal documents are simpler than they actually are." Elena checked Margaret's positioning in her wheelchair, but her hands lingered a moment longer than necessary on Margaret's shoulder, a gesture that felt like reassurance. "Mrs. Sullivan seems more alert today," Elena observed to Rose. "Sometimes patients have good days when they're less confused about important decisions." "They're giving me an opening," Margaret realized, Both women were creating space for her to acknowledge their suspicions, without forcing her to drop her protective cover completely. Margaret let her gaze focus slightly, looking directly at Rose for a moment that lasted just long enough to be intentional, before letting her eyes drift away again. It was the smallest possible signal, but both women caught it immediately. Rose's smile became genuinely warm for the first time. "Yes, I think she's having a very good day today." As Elena prepared to wheel Margaret back to her room for lunch, Rose leaned close enough to whisper words meant only for Margaret's ears. "When you're ready to stop performing, we'll be here. But don't wait too long. Some shows need to end before the theater burns down around you." Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in 18 months, hope mixed with genuine partnership. Elena and Rose had recognized her situation and chosen to protect her, asking for nothing in return but the chance to help someone fight back against institutional cruelty. For the first time since this nightmare began, Margaret Sullivan wasn't entirely alone. The question now was whether she could find the courage to trust them with her secret before David's desperation made trust irrelevant. As they moved through Willowbrook Manor's hallways, Margaret began to understand that her performance was approaching its final act. The only question was whether she would control how it ended, or if that choice would be taken from her, just like everything else. Rose's warning about theaters burning down still echoed in Margaret's mind when Tommy arrived the next afternoon, carrying his backpack and the earnest expression that always made her heart ache with protective love. At 16, he possessed an intelligence that reminded her painfully of herself at his age, curious, persistent, and dangerously perceptive. "Hey, Grandma!" Tommy settled into the chair beside her wheelchair, pulling out a thick history textbook. "I brought my homework again. Mr. Davidson says I should research successful business leaders from the past 50 years, and I keep thinking about Sullivan Industries." Margaret maintained her vacant stare, but internally she felt the familiar tension between wanting to help him and needing to protect her cover. Tommy's visits had become increasingly dangerous, not because he meant harm, but because his genuine affection made him notice details others missed. "I found some old articles about you in the library archives," Tommy continued, opening his notebook. "Did you know they called you the Iron Lady of Industrial Development? The article said you started with nothing and built an empire worth millions." 52 million at last count, Margaret thought, watching her grandson's face light up with pride. He spoke about her accomplishments with the reverence most teenagers reserved for sports heroes or musicians. Tommy leaned closer, lowering his voice to the conspiratorial whisper he used when he thought she might actually understand. "Grandma, I know Dad says you can't remember things, but sometimes when I'm talking about the business stuff, your eyes change. Like you're really listening." Margaret's pulse quickened. This was exactly what she'd feared. Tommy's intelligence working against both of them. His observations were becoming too precise, too dangerous for them both. "I've been thinking about what Mr. Davidson taught us about corporate structures," Tommy continued, his homework apparently forgotten. "He said family trusts are designed to protect assets across generations. That got me wondering about ours." The word ours hit Margaret like a physical blow. Tommy was starting to think like an heir, which meant he was starting to ask the kinds of questions that would make David very nervous. "Dad's been acting weird lately." Tommy's voice dropped even further. "Mom says he's stressed about work, but I heard him on the phone talking about liquidating assets. That means selling things, right? Things from the trust?" Margaret fought to keep her expression neutral as her grandson displayed the exact kind of financial literacy that David would see as a threat. Tommy was connecting dots that could lead him directly into danger. "I looked up the Meridian Group too," Tommy added casually, and Margaret's blood turned to ice. "They're not exactly the kind of business partners Grandpa would have approved of, are they?" Before Margaret could process the implications of Tommy's research, Dr. Wright's familiar voice interrupted from the doorway. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Sullivan." "Tommy." Dr. Wright approached with his usual professional demeanor, but Margaret noticed how his eyes lingered on Tommy's notebook with obvious curiosity. "Mind if I join you for a few minutes?" Tommy closed his notebook quickly. Too quickly. The gesture caught Dr. Wright's attention immediately. "Homework?" Dr. Wright asked pleasantly. "Just history stuff," Tommy replied, but his voice carried the careful neutrality of someone hiding something important. Dr. Wright settled into a nearby chair, his attention shifting to Margaret with the clinical focus she'd learned to dread. "Mrs. Sullivan, I wanted to follow up on some of the observations from your recent evaluations." Margaret allowed her gaze to drift toward the window, maintaining the disconnected expression that had protected her for so long. But she could feel both Tommy and Dr. Wright watching her with new intensity. "Tommy," Dr. Wright continued, "your father mentioned you spend quite a bit of time visiting your grandmother. Have you noticed any changes in her behavior recently?" The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to spring. Margaret held her breath as Tommy considered his answer, knowing that his response could either protect her secret or expose everything they'd both worked to hide. Tommy's silence stretched for several heartbeats, his young face wrestling with conflicting loyalties as Dr. Wright waited for an answer. Margaret felt the weight of her grandson's dilemma: tell the truth about his observations and potentially expose her, or lie to a doctor and become complicit in whatever he suspected was happening. "She seems the same," Tommy finally said, his voice carefully neutral. "Sometimes I think she recognizes me, but Dad says that's normal. That people with dementia have good moments and bad moments." Dr. Wright nodded, but Margaret caught the slight furrow in his brow that suggested Tommy's diplomatic answer hadn't satisfied his curiosity. "And these good moments, what do they look like to you?" Before Tommy could answer, David's voice cut through the afternoon quiet from the doorway, sharp with barely controlled irritation. "There you are, Tommy. I told you not to bother your grandmother today." David strode into the room with the aggressive energy Margaret had learned to recognize as desperation masquerading as authority. "Dr. Wright, perfect timing. We need to discuss Mother's care plan." Margaret noticed how David positioned himself between Tommy and Dr. Wright, effectively blocking any further conversation. Her son's face carried the strain of someone operating on borrowed time, and she could see the slight tremor in his hands that suggested either substance withdrawal or extreme stress. "Actually, Mr. Sullivan, I was hoping to complete my evaluation without interruption," Dr. Wright said diplomatically. "Family input is valuable, but I prefer to observe patients in their natural interactions first." "Tommy, wait in the car." David's command brooked no argument. "Your grandmother needs medical attention, not homework help." Tommy gathered his things reluctantly, but as he passed Margaret's chair, he leaned down as if to kiss her goodbye. His whisper was so soft only she could hear it. "I know you're in there, Grandma. I don't know what's happening, but I'm going to figure it out." Margaret's heart clenched as Tommy left, his words carrying both promise and threat. Her grandson's determination to protect her could destroy them both if David realized how much the boy had pieced together. "Now then," David settled into Tommy's vacated chair with obvious relief. "Dr. Wright, we need to discuss accelerating Mother's treatment plan. Her condition has been deteriorating more rapidly than we anticipated." Margaret maintained her vacant stare, while internally cataloging every lie David was about to tell. Dr. Wright's expression remained professionally neutral, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested skepticism. "I haven't observed significant changes in your mother's condition during my recent visits," Dr. Wright said carefully. "Her cognitive baseline has remained fairly stable over the past several months." "That's just it," David leaned forward with practiced concern. "The stability is misleading. At home, during family visits, we're seeing increased agitation, confusion about basic care needs, even some aggressive behavior towards staff." Lies. Margaret had never displayed aggressive behavior toward anyone. David was constructing a narrative that would justify whatever action he was planning to take. "I see." Dr. Wright made notes in Margaret's file. "Can you give me specific examples of this behavioral change? Last week she became violent when Elena tried to help her with medication," David continued seamlessly. "Yesterday she tried to leave the facility on her own, claiming she had important business meetings to attend. The delusions are becoming more elaborate and dangerous." Margaret felt rage build in her chest as David painted her as a dangerous, unpredictable patient who needed stronger controls. Elena would never corroborate his story about violence, but David seemed confident that his word would carry more weight than a nurse's observations. "These episodes sound quite serious," Dr. Wright said, though his tone carried subtle doubt. "I'm surprised the nursing staff hasn't documented any of these incidents in your mother's daily reports." David's jaw tightened slightly. "I think the staff sometimes minimizes these situations. They don't want to admit when they can't handle a patient's needs. Perhaps we should review the actual incident reports," Dr. Wright suggested, "and speak with the nursing staff about their observations." Before David could respond, Jennifer's voice interrupted from the doorway. Margaret's daughter looked exhausted, her usually perfect appearance showing signs of strain that suggested sleepless nights and difficult decisions. "David? I've been looking for you." Jennifer's tone carried an edge Margaret hadn't heard in years, the sound of someone who had reached the limits of their patience. "We need to talk." "Not now, Jen. Dr. Wright and I are discussing Mother's medical needs." "Actually, this is exactly the right time." Jennifer stepped fully into the room, and Margaret could see papers clutched in her sister's hands. "Dr. Wright, I think you should see these financial documents I found in David's car." David shot to his feet, his face flushing with anger. "Those are private family matters. You had no right." "Number right?" Jennifer's voice rose with years of suppressed frustration. "David, these show you've been accessing Mom's accounts for months. Transferring money, liquidating investments, all while claiming she's too incompetent to manage her own affairs." Margaret watched her children face each other across her wheelchair, their long simmering conflict finally erupting into open warfare. Dr. Wright observed the confrontation with growing alarm, his clinical detachment giving way to obvious concern about the family dynamics he was witnessing. "Jennifer, you don't understand the complexity of managing Mother's finances." David's voice carried the patronizing tone he used when he wanted to end discussions. "These decisions require expertise that—" "Expertise?" Jennifer's laugh was bitter. "David, I've been reviewing the trust documents. You've transferred nearly $3 million in the past 6 months alone to gambling debts, according to these receipts I found." The room fell into stunned silence. Margaret felt a surge of fierce pride in her daughter for finally standing up to David's manipulations, mixed with terror about what David might do when cornered this completely. Dr. Wright cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps this family discussion should take place privately. I can return later to complete Mrs. Sullivan's evaluation." "No," Jennifer's voice carried new authority. "Dr. Wright, I think you need to understand what's really happening here. My brother has been systematically stealing from our mother while claiming she's incompetent to stop him." David stepped toward Jennifer with barely controlled rage. "Shut up, Jennifer. You have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Jennifer held up more papers. "David, I found the Meridian Group contracts. Loan shark money at 30% interest. You're not managing Mom's care. You're feeding her fortune to your gambling addiction." Margaret watched her son's carefully constructed facade crumble in real time. The mask of concerned son disappeared, replaced by the desperate fury of someone whose schemes were collapsing around him. "You stupid bitch." David's voice dropped to a whisper that was more threatening than shouting. "You have no idea what you've just done." Dr. Wright stood abruptly, his professional composure finally breaking. "Mr. Sullivan, I think this conversation needs to end. And I believe we need to involve the facilities administration in reviewing your mother's care situation." David's gaze swept the room. From Dr. Wright's disapproving face, to Jennifer's defiant posture, to Margaret's apparently vacant stare. Margaret could see him calculating odds, weighing options, deciding how much damage control was still possible. When his eyes met Margaret's, she saw something that chilled her to the bone. David was no longer pretending to care about her welfare. He was looking at her like an obstacle that needed to be eliminated before it could cause more problems. "Fine," David said finally, his voice carrying a calm that was far more frightening than his previous anger. "We'll continue this discussion later, when there are fewer witnesses around to misinterpret family business." He left without another word, but his departure felt more like a threat than a retreat. Margaret understood that the fragile balance she'd maintained for 18 months had finally shattered. David's desperation had reached the point where her continued existence, whether lucid or not, had become inconvenient. Jennifer sank into the chair David had vacated, her hands shaking as the adrenaline of confrontation faded. "Dr. Wright, I think my mother is in real danger." Margaret couldn't have agreed more. But the question now was whether she could trust Jennifer and Dr. Wright with the truth, or if maintaining her deception was the only thing standing between her and whatever David was planning to do about his problem. Outside her window, storm clouds were gathering over Willowbrook Manor's peaceful grounds. Margaret Sullivan sat in her wheelchair, apparently oblivious to the crisis swirling around her, and prepared for the fight of her life. The storm that had been gathering outside Margaret's window broke just after midnight, rain lashing against the glass in sheets that matched the turbulence Margaret felt building inside Willowbrook Manor's walls. She'd spent the hours since David's departure cataloging every possible outcome of Jennifer's confrontation, and none of them ended well for her continued safety. Dr. Wright had returned that evening, but not alone. He'd brought the facility's administrator, Mrs. Hendricks, and their hushed conversation in the hallway had carried the weight of serious institutional concern. Margaret had caught fragments through her partially open door, phrases like financial exploitation, family dysfunction, and most ominously, patient welfare evaluation. Now, as the night shift settled into their routine, Margaret waited for what she knew was coming. David's threat about continuing their discussion when there are fewer witnesses had been more than empty posturing. He was planning something, and her 18 months of careful observation told her it would happen soon. Elena's soft footsteps announced the midnight medication rounds, but tonight she moved with unusual purpose toward Margaret's room. When she entered, Margaret could see the tension in the nurse's shoulders, the way her professional mask barely concealed deep concern. "Mrs. Sullivan," Elena's voice was carefully neutral, but her eyes swept the room as if checking for surveillance. "I need to speak with you about some changes to your care plan." Margaret maintained her vacant expression while Elena performed the routine of checking her vital signs, but both women understood this was no ordinary visit. Elena's hands were steady and professional, but Margaret caught the slight tremor that suggested suppressed anxiety. "Your son David has requested some adjustments to your evening medications," Elena continued, her voice carrying undertones Margaret found alarming. "Something to help with the agitation episodes he described to Dr. Wright. Episodes that never happened." Margaret's pulse quickened as she realized David was escalating his fabricated narrative. New medications meant new symptoms he could claim, new behaviors he could document, and potentially new levels of sedation that would make her truly helpless. Elena leaned closer, ostensibly adjusting Margaret's blankets but actually positioning herself for whispered conversation. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need you to understand what's happening. The medications your son is requesting, they're powerful antipsychotics typically reserved for patients with severe behavioral disorders." Margaret's blood turned to ice. Antipsychotics would cloud her mind, make coherent thought difficult, and provide David with the medical evidence he needed to justify any action he wanted to take. Worse, they would make it impossible for her to maintain the careful balance between apparent confusion and functional awareness that had kept her alive. "Dr. Wright has concerns about the family dynamics he witnessed today," Elena continued softly. "But he's also required to follow family requests for patient care, especially when there's documented medical justification." The weight of Margaret's situation pressed down like the storm outside. David was using the medical system itself as a weapon against her, knowing that doctors would trust family members over their own observations, especially when dealing with elderly patients whose competency was already in question. Elena's next words were barely audible. If someone were fully aware and wanted to prevent this from happening, they would need to speak up soon. "Before the new medication orders are implemented tomorrow morning." Margaret felt the walls of her carefully constructed protection closing in. Maintaining her deception now meant accepting chemical lobotomization. Breaking her silence meant trusting Elena with everything and hoping that an immigrant nurse's word would carry weight against David's family authority and financial resources. The door opened quietly, and Rose Chen appeared in the hallway, moving with the confident stride of someone who belonged anywhere she chose to be. Elena stepped back to professional distance as Rose entered the room. "Evening rounds seem busy tonight," Rose observed casually, but her sharp eyes took in every detail of the scene. "I hope Mrs. Sullivan isn't having trouble sleeping." "Some medication adjustments to discuss," Elena replied diplomatically. "Mr. Sullivan has requested changes to help with recent behavioral concerns." Rose's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Behavioral concerns? How interesting. I've been observing Mrs. Sullivan for months and haven't noticed any concerning behaviors, but then, I suppose different people see different things." Margaret watched the careful dance between her two potential allies, understanding that they were communicating in code while maintaining plausible deniability. Rose's presence wasn't accidental. She was here because she knew something was happening. "Mrs. Chen," Elena said carefully, "as a former attorney, what would you say about situations where family members request medical interventions that seem inconsistent with a patient's observed behaviors?" Rose settled into the bedside chair with the deliberate movements of someone preparing for a long conversation. "Well, speaking hypothetically, I'd say that medical professionals have both ethical and legal obligations to verify the accuracy of family reports before implementing potentially harmful treatments." She turned to Margaret with an expression that seemed casual, but carried unmistakable intensity. "Of course, the patient's own wishes should be the primary consideration, assuming they're capable of expressing those wishes clearly." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and dangerous possibilities. Margaret felt the weight of 18 months of deception pressing against her need for survival. Elena and Rose were offering her a lifeline, but taking it meant abandoning the safety of invisibility forever. Dr. Wright's voice from the hallway interrupted their silent tableau. He was speaking quietly with Mrs. Hendricks, but Margaret caught enough words to understand they were discussing her case specifically. Family conflict makes assessment difficult. Patients' best interests versus family authority need clearer documentation of actual behaviors. Elena straightened as footsteps approached Margaret's room. Dr. Wright appeared in the doorway, looking tired but determined. Behind him, Mrs. Hendricks carried a manila folder that Margaret recognized as her medical file. "Mrs. Vasquez, Mrs. Chen," Dr. Wright nodded to both women. "I'm glad you're both here. I wanted to discuss Mrs. Sullivan's care with witnesses present." He moved to Margaret's bedside, his manner more formal than usual. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need to inform you of some requested changes to your treatment plan. Your son David has expressed concerns about increased agitation and has requested additional medications to help manage these symptoms." Margaret maintained her vacant stare, but internally she felt the trap closing around her. Dr. Wright was following proper protocols, informing her of treatment changes even though he believed she couldn't understand. The irony was devastating. He was being ethically correct while potentially destroying her. "However," Dr. Wright continued, "I have some concerns about implementing these changes without more thorough evaluation." Rose leaned forward slightly. "What kind of concerns, doctor?" "The behaviors described by Mr. Sullivan don't match my own observations or the nursing staff reports," Dr. Wright said carefully. "Mrs. Vasquez, have you witnessed any of the aggressive episodes Mr. Sullivan described?" Elena shook her head firmly. "No, doctor. Mrs. Sullivan has been consistently cooperative and calm during all my interactions with her. I've seen no evidence of agitation, aggression, or dangerous behaviors." Mrs. Hendricks made notes in the file. "And yet Mr. Sullivan was quite specific about these incidents. He provided dates and detailed descriptions. Descriptions that aren't supported by our daily care logs," Elena replied with quiet conviction. "I've reviewed every shift report for the past 3 months. There are no documented behavioral incidents involving Mrs. Sullivan." Margaret watched Dr. Wright process this information, seeing him wrestle with the implications. His medical training told him to trust family input, but his observations and Elena's testimony suggested David was fabricating symptoms. "Mrs. Chen," Dr. Wright turned to Rose, As someone who spends considerable time in the common areas, have you observed any concerning behaviors from Mrs. Sullivan? Rose's response carried the precise weight of legal testimony. Doctor, in my 6 months of residence here, I have never witnessed Mrs. Sullivan display aggression, agitation, or any behavior that would constitute a danger to herself or others. In fact, I would characterize her as one of the most peaceful residents in this facility. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Dr. Wright looked from Rose to Elena to Margaret, his professional certainty clearly shaken by the contradiction between family reports and staff observations. Mrs. Hendricks, he said finally, I think we need to postpone any medication changes until we can conduct a more thorough assessment. I want to observe Mrs. Sullivan myself over the next few days before implementing any new treatments. Margaret felt a surge of relief mixed with terror. She'd gained time, but at the cost of increased scrutiny that could expose her deception. Dr. Wright's evaluation would be more intensive than anything she'd faced before. As the small group prepared to leave, Elena lingered for a moment, adjusting Margaret's blankets one final time. Her whisper was so soft, it barely disturbed the air. You have maybe 48 hours. After that, the evaluation will either prove your competency or confirm their narrative. Choose carefully. Rose paused at the doorway, her words carrying the authority of someone who understood legal deadlines. Some decisions can't be delayed indefinitely. The clock is running now. Margaret was alone again, listening to the storm rage outside while facing the most crucial decision of her life. She had allies now, but their ability to help depended entirely on her willingness to trust them with the truth. The performance that had protected her for 18 months was about to face its ultimate test. In less than 2 days, she would either reclaim her voice or lose it forever to David's chemical solutions to his, quote, problem. Outside, lightning illuminated the grounds of Willowbrook Manor in stark, momentary clarity. Margaret Sullivan sat in her wheelchair, apparently oblivious to the crisis swirling around her, and prepared to make the choice between safety and freedom that would define the rest of her life. The morning after the storm brought deceptive calm to Willowbrook Manor, but Margaret could feel the tension crackling beneath the surface like electricity before lightning strikes. She'd spent the sleepless hours weighing Elena's 48-hour deadline against the risks of maintaining her deception, and every calculation led to the same terrifying conclusion. Her time was running out. Jennifer arrived earlier than usual, her face showing the strain of someone who had made difficult decisions during a long, dark night. She moved with new purpose as she entered Margaret's room, carrying a leather portfolio that Margaret recognized as her own, retrieved from storage, most likely, where David had hidden it along with other reminders of her former competence. "Good morning, Mom." Jennifer's voice carried a tenderness Margaret hadn't heard in months. "I brought some things I thought you might want to see. Photos, documents from the business, memories from when you were running Sullivan Industries." Margaret maintained her vacant expression, but internally she felt her heart constrict at her daughter's word choice. When you were running. Past tense, as if that woman had died and left only this shell behind. Jennifer settled into the bedside chair and opened the portfolio with careful reverence. The first photograph showed Margaret at a groundbreaking ceremony, wearing a hard hat and wielding a ceremonial shovel, while surrounded by men in expensive suits who had initially dismissed her as a novelty. "I found this in your office files," Jennifer said softly, studying Margaret's face for any sign of recognition. "You were so proud that day. The Henderson Development Project, your first major contract. Dad said you worked 18-hour days for months to make it happen." Margaret remembered that day with crystalline clarity. The Henderson Project had been her proof of concept, the deal that established Sullivan Industries as a serious player in commercial development. She'd been 38 years old, hungry with ambition, and absolutely convinced she could build something that would last generations. The irony was devastating. She'd built an empire to provide security for her family, and now that same empire was being used as a weapon against her by the son who should have been its guardian. "I've been going through your business records," Jennifer continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Mom, what you built was incredible. The complexity of the investments, the strategic partnerships, the way you diversified across different markets. David could never manage something like this. No, he couldn't. Margaret had known that for years, which was why she'd structured the trust to provide steady income without requiring active management. David's gambling addiction had made even that precaution insufficient. Jennifer turned the page to reveal financial documents, quarterly reports, investment summaries, and trust fund statements. I hired an independent accountant to review these. Mom, David has been systematically looting your assets. Not just borrowing, stealing. $3.7 million in 18 months. Margaret's pulse quickened as Jennifer laid out the evidence of David's betrayal with the precision of a prosecutor building a case. Her daughter had clearly spent considerable time and money investigating the family finances, and the picture she was painting was even worse than Margaret had realized. The Meridian Group contracts are particularly damaging, Jennifer continued, holding up documents Margaret recognized as loan agreements. 38% annual interest on gambling debts, totaling nearly $2 million. David used your portfolio as collateral without any legal authority to do so. The weight of her son's desperation became clear as Jennifer outlined the full scope of his financial crisis. David wasn't just stealing to fund his gambling. He was trapped in a cycle of escalating debt that would consume everything she'd built unless someone stopped him. But here's what I don't understand. Jennifer's voice carried a note of confusion that made Margaret's blood turn cold. Some of these investment decisions from the past 2 years, they're brilliant. Market timing that protected the portfolio from major losses, strategic moves that actually increased value despite David's withdrawals. Margaret forced herself to remain motionless as Jennifer described decisions she had made herself. Phone calls to brokers during David's absence, online trades executed during the night shift when Elena was busy with other patients. Her financial expertise hadn't disappeared with her supposed dementia, and she'd been quietly protecting what remained of her fortune while documenting David's thefts. The accountant says whoever made these decisions has sophisticated understanding of market dynamics and corporate finance, Jennifer continued, studying Margaret's face with growing intensity. The kind of expertise that doesn't just vanish because of cognitive decline. This was the moment Margaret had been dreading, when her own competence became evidence against her deception. She'd been too skilled, too careful in protecting her assets, and now that very skill was raising questions she couldn't afford to have answered. The door opened without warning, and David entered with the aggressive energy Margaret had learned to recognize as panic disguised as control. His appearance was more disheveled than usual. Wrinkled clothing, unshaven face, the telltale signs of someone whose world was collapsing faster than he could manage. "Jennifer, what the hell are you doing here?" David's voice carried barely controlled fury as he took in the scattered documents. "I told you to stay out of family business." "This is family business," Jennifer replied with newfound steel in her voice. "David, I know what you've been doing. The accounting fraud, the forged authorizations, the illegal use of Mom's assets as loan collateral." David stepped closer, his hands clenching into fists. "You don't know anything. Mother is incompetent, legally, medically incompetent. Any financial management requires family oversight." "Oversight?" Jennifer's laugh was bitter. "David, you've stolen nearly $4 million. That's not oversight, that's embezzlement." Margaret watched her children face each other across her wheelchair, their conflict finally stripped of all pretense. David's mask of concerned son had completely disappeared, replaced by the cornered desperation of someone with nothing left to lose. "You think you understand how this works?" David's voice dropped to a whisper that was more threatening than shouting. "Jennifer, you have no idea what the Meridian Group does to people who can't pay their debts. I'm protecting this family by accessing Mother's money before—" "Before what?" Jennifer interrupted. "Before they break your legs?" "David, this is your problem, not Mom's. Your gambling addiction doesn't give you the right to destroy everything she worked for." David's face flushed with rage. "She's gone, Jennifer! Look at her. She hasn't said a coherent word in 18 months. She's a vegetable who happens to have a trust fund, and that money is going to sit there doing nothing while I lose everything. So you decided to steal it. I decided to use family resources to solve family problems." David's justification was practiced, as if he'd been rehearsing it for months. "Once the guardianship is finalized, everything I've done will be retroactively legal." Margaret felt sick listening to her son reduce her existence to a legal technicality. In David's mind, she'd already died 18 months ago. Everything since then was just paperwork determining who would inherit her corpse's assets. Jennifer gathered the documents with deliberate care. David, I've already spoken with the district attorney's office about potential elder abuse charges, and I've contacted the trustee of Mom's original estate to review your access to family funds. David went completely still, his face pale with shock. You did what? I'm protecting our mother from you, Jennifer said simply. Someone has to. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Margaret understood that Jennifer had just declared war on David, using the legal system as her weapon. The question was whether David would retreat or escalate his own desperate measures. David's phone began buzzing insistently. When he glanced at the screen, his face went ashen. I have to take this. He stepped into the hallway, but his voice carried clearly back into the room. No, I told you the money would be available this week. Yes, I understand the consequences of default. Just give me 48 hours. Margaret's heart hammered as she realized David's creditors were applying immediate pressure. 48 hours. The same timeline Elena had given her to make her decision about revealing the truth. When David returned, his demeanor had shifted from anger to something far more dangerous. The calm of someone who had decided desperate measures were his only option. Jennifer. His voice was steady now, unnaturally controlled. I think you should leave. Mother needs rest, and your investigation.is causing her unnecessary stress. I'm not going anywhere, Jennifer replied firmly. In fact, I'm arranging for private security to monitor Mom's care until we can resolve the legal issues around her assets. David's smile was cold and sharp. That won't be necessary. Dr. Wright is implementing some new treatments that will help Mother's condition. She'll be much more comfortable soon. Margaret understood the threat immediately. The antipsychotic medications Elena had warned her about, David was still planning to have her chemically sedated, regardless of Dr. Wright's hesitations or Jennifer's legal maneuvering. What treatments? Jennifer's voice carried immediate suspicion. Medications to help with the agitation episodes, David replied smoothly. Dr. Wright agrees that Mother needs stronger intervention for her behavioral problems. What behavioral problems? Mom hasn't shown any. You weren't here last week when she became violent with the nursing staff. David continued his fabricated narrative. Or when she tried to leave the facility claiming she had business meetings to attend. The delusions are getting worse. Jennifer looked from David to Margaret, her expression troubled. I haven't seen any signs of agitation or delusion. Because you're not here enough to witness them, David replied with practiced certainty. The medical staff has documented everything. Margaret sat motionless in her wheelchair, listening to her son construct a false reality that would justify whatever action he planned to take. She could see Jennifer wavering, torn between her suspicions about David and her uncertainty about Margaret's true condition. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken accusations and dangerous possibilities. Margaret realized that Jennifer's investigation had accelerated David's timeline, but it had also created new opportunities for alliance. Her daughter was fighting for her, but fighting blind. Jennifer suspected David of financial crimes, but she didn't yet understand that Margaret herself was fully aware and capable of fighting back. The question was whether Margaret could find a way to signal her lucidity to Jennifer without exposing herself to David's retaliation. Because one thing was becoming clear. David's 48-hour deadline for accessing her money coincided exactly with Elena's deadline for Margaret to reveal her secret. Someone was going to make a move very soon, and Margaret Sullivan needed to decide whether she would remain a victim or finally become a participant in the battle for her own life. The 36 hours following Jennifer's confrontation with David moved with the inexorable momentum of avalanche gathering speed. Margaret felt the walls of her carefully constructed world compressing around her as competing forces. David's desperation, Jennifer's investigation, Elena's protective instincts, and Dr. Wright's growing suspicions converged toward a crisis point she could no longer control. Elena had been reassigned to day shift temporarily, a move that Margaret recognized as David's attempt to isolate her from her most observant ally. The night nurse who replaced Elena was competent but uninterested in anything beyond basic medical care, leaving Margaret truly alone during the hours when she'd grown accustomed to having a potential confidant nearby. Rose Chen had also become notably scarce, her usual presence in the common areas replaced by strategic absences that suggested she was coordinating something behind the scenes. When Margaret did glimpse her, Rose's expression carried the focused intensity of a lawyer preparing for trial, methodical, determined, and slightly dangerous. The morning of Margaret's deadline brought an unexpected visitor. Tommy arrived alone, his 16-year-old face carrying a gravity that made him seem years older. He'd clearly been researching more than just history homework, and the manila folder he carried suggested he'd uncovered information that could change everything. "Hey, Grandma." Tommy's voice carried the careful control of someone who had practiced this conversation. "I need to tell you some things. Important things. And I really hope you can understand me." Margaret maintained her vacant expression, while internally bracing herself for whatever her grandson had discovered. Tommy's intelligence had always been both a comfort and a concern. Now it might become the catalyst that destroyed her protective deception. Tommy pulled his chair close to her wheelchair and opened the folder with deliberate precision. "I've been doing research on something called financial elder abuse. Did you know it's the fastest-growing crime in America? And that family members are the perpetrators in over 60% of cases?" His words hit Margaret like physical blows. Tommy wasn't just asking academic questions anymore. He was building a case, using the same methodical approach that had made her successful in business. "I also researched the Meridian Group," Tommy continued, his voice dropping to confidential tones. "Grandma, they're not just loan sharks. They're connected to organized crime operations that specialize in asset recovery. The kind of people who make problems disappear permanently." Margaret's blood turned to ice as Tommy outlined the scope of David's entanglement with forces far more dangerous than simple gambling debts. If the Meridian Group was connected to organized crime, then David's desperation had put the entire family at risk. "But here's the thing that really bothers me." Tommy leaned closer, his young eyes searching her face with uncomfortable intensity. "I've been watching Dad's behavior, and it doesn't make sense. He's acting like someone who's afraid of getting caught, not someone who's trying to help a sick family member." Margaret fought to keep her breathing steady, as Tommy demonstrated the same analytical skills that had made her a formidable businesswoman. He was connecting dots that adults had missed or chosen to ignore. "And there's something else." Tommy's voice became barely audible. "I've been recording Dad's phone calls when he thinks no one's listening. Grandma, he's not talking about your medical care. He's talking about eliminating obstacles to accessing your money." The folder contained printouts of call logs, transcribed conversations, and financial documents that Tommy had somehow obtained. Margaret realized her grandson had been conducting his own investigation parallel to Jennifer's, but with the advantage of living in David's house and observing his behavior up close. "The thing is," Tommy continued, studying Margaret's face with laser focus, "sometimes when I'm talking to you about business stuff, your eyes change. Like you're really listening and understanding everything. And yesterday, when I mentioned the Henderson Development Project, you moved your hand exactly the way you used to when you were thinking about complex problems." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. Tommy's observations were too precise, too accurate to dismiss. He'd been documenting her unconscious responses with the same attention to detail she'd once brought to market analysis. Before she could decide how to respond, Dr. Wright's voice interrupted from the doorway. But he wasn't alone. 2 people in official-looking suits accompanied him, their badges identifying them as representatives from Adult Protective Services. "Mrs. Sullivan, Tommy." Dr. Wright's voice carried formal gravity. "We need to conduct an emergency competency evaluation." Margaret felt the room tilt around her. This was David's endgame, forcing a legal determination of her mental capacity under circumstances where maintaining her deception would result in chemical sedation, while revealing her lucidity would expose 18 months of elaborate fraud. The lead investigator, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, introduced herself as Sarah Chen, no relation to Rose, but carrying the same aura of legal authority. Mrs. Sullivan, Sarah's voice was professionally neutral, we've received reports of potential financial exploitation and requests for emergency guardianship procedures. We need to assess your current cognitive status and living situation. Tommy rose from his chair, his folder clutched protectively against his chest. What kind of assessment? Standard competency evaluation, Dr. Wright explained. Cognitive function tests, reality orientation, decision-making capacity. The results will determine whether Mrs. Sullivan requires legal protection or can continue managing her own affairs. Margaret understood the trap perfectly. The evaluation would be designed to confirm David's narrative of cognitive decline, using her own protective behavior as evidence against her. But refusing to participate would be taken as confirmation of incompetence. We'll also need to interview family members about observed behaviors and care needs, Sarah continued. Mr. David Sullivan has provided extensive documentation about his mother's condition. What about other family members? Tommy's voice carried challenge. My Aunt Jennifer has been investigating the financial management, and she's found some problems with Dad's handling of Grandma's money. Sarah's expression sharpened with interest. What kind of problems? Before Tommy could answer, David's voice cut through the room with barely controlled panic. Tommy, what are you doing here? I told you to stay away from the facility today. David entered with Elena close behind him, her face carrying the grim determination of someone preparing for battle. Margaret realized that Elena's reassignment to day shift hadn't been punishment. It had been strategic positioning for this moment. Mr. Sullivan, Sarah addressed David directly. We need to discuss some discrepancies in the financial records you submitted. There appear to be unauthorized transactions and forged authorizations that require explanation. David's face went pale, but his voice remained steady. Any financial management has been conducted with proper medical consultation. My mother's condition requires family oversight of her assets. That's interesting, Elena interjected, because our daily care logs show no evidence of the behavioral problems you've reported. Mrs. Sullivan has been consistently cooperative and oriented during all my interactions with her. Margaret watched the confrontation unfold around her wheelchair, understanding that this was the moment when all the various threads of deception and investigation would either weave together into her salvation or strangle her completely. Sarah turned to Margaret with professional focus. Mrs. Sullivan, I need to ask you some direct questions. Can you tell me what year it is? The moment had arrived. Margaret felt the weight of 18 months of performance pressing against her need for survival. Elena's eyes met hers with encouraging intensity. Tommy clutched his evidence folder like a lifeline. Even Rose Chen appeared in the doorway, her presence adding legal weight to whatever was about to happen. David stepped closer to Margaret's wheelchair, his voice carrying subtle threat despite its gentle tone. Mother, these people are here to help. Just answer their questions as best you can. Margaret looked around the room at the faces watching her, some with hope, some with fear, some with calculation. Dr. Wright held his pen ready to document her responses. Sarah waited with professional patience. Elena's slight nod seemed to say, "It's time." The performance that had protected her for 18 months was about to end. The question was whether she would control the finale or let others write the ending for her. Margaret Sullivan took a deep breath, felt the weight of her decision settle in her chest like stone, and prepared to reclaim her voice in a room full of people who thought they knew who she was. But first, she met David's eyes directly, a look that lasted just long enough to let him know that his mother had been watching, listening, and remembering everything. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 18 months of buried truth about to surface. Margaret Sullivan straightened her shoulders in the wheelchair, a movement so subtle yet so decisive that everyone in the room felt the shift in atmosphere. The vacant stare that had been her shield for 18 months, sharpened into the laser focus that had once commanded boardrooms and built empires. The year is 2025. Margaret's voice cut through the silence like a blade, clear and strong and utterly lucid. Today is March 15th. And I have been listening to every word that has been spoken about me, to me, and around me for the past 18 months. The reaction was immediate and electric. Dr. Wright's pen clattered to the floor. Sarah, from Adult Protective Services, went rigid with professional alertness. Tommy's face lit up with vindication and relief. Elena smiled with fierce satisfaction. But David's face drained of all color, his expression cycling through disbelief, panic, and finally settling into the cornered fury of someone whose entire world had just collapsed. "That's impossible." David's voice was barely a whisper. You haven't spoken coherently in 18 months, Margaret finished for him, her voice carrying the steel authority that had once made grown men in expensive suits listen when she spoke. 18 months since I overheard you on my kitchen phone, discussing how to manage my situation with the Meridian Group breathing down your neck for gambling debts you'd run up to $2 million. She reached beneath her wheelchair's armrest, retrieving the hidden compartment with practiced precision. The small digital recorder, photographs, and leather-bound notebook materialized like evidence from a magic trick that had been 18 months in the making. I have documented every conversation, every theft, every forged signature, and every lie you've told about my condition, Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. David, you've stolen $3.7 million from my trust fund. You've used my assets as collateral for illegal loans. And you've systematically destroyed the reputation of a business I spent 40 years building. Sarah stepped forward, her professional training kicking in as she recognized the magnitude of what she was witnessing. Mrs. Sullivan, are you saying you've been competent this entire time? Completely competent, Margaret replied with crisp authority. I've been maintaining my own investment portfolio, protecting what assets I could from David's theft, and gathering evidence of his financial crimes. Check the trading records from the past 2 years. Every profitable decision that kept us from complete ruin was mine. Dr. Wright found his voice, though it carried the shaken tone of someone whose professional judgment had been completely undermined. Margaret. Mrs. Sullivan, the cognitive assessments, the symptoms I observed, were performed exactly as I researched them, Margaret said with a slight smile that held no warmth. Doctor, I studied dementia progression with the same thoroughness I once used to analyze market trends. Every vacant stare, every moment of apparent confusion, every failure to respond, all carefully calculated to match David's timeline for my supposed decline. Tommy stepped forward, his folder of evidence clutched like a weapon. Grandma, I knew something was wrong. Dad's been talking about eliminating obstacles to the money, and I recorded. You recorded his conversations, Margaret finished, her expression softening as she looked at her grandson. Tommy, you brilliant boy. You were gathering evidence too, weren't you? I knew you were still in there, Tommy's voice cracked with emotion. When I talked about the business, about Sullivan Industries, your eyes would change. You were listening to everything. David's silence had stretched too long, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the desperate edge of someone with nothing left to lose. This is insane. She's clearly having some kind of psychotic episode. Sarah, you can't seriously believe. I believe the evidence, Margaret interrupted, activating the digital recorder. David's voice filled the room, captured weeks ago in what he'd believed was a private conversation. The trust fund is worth $12 million now. Once we have guardianship, I can access the principal. Not just the interest payments she's been living on. The recording continued with Jennifer's voice expressing doubt, followed by David's dismissive response. She's not recovering, Jen. Look at her. She can barely remember her own name half the time. Margaret stopped the playback and looked directly at Sarah. There are hours of recordings like this. David discussing my supposed incompetence while simultaneously describing how he plans to liquidate my assets. He's been running a con game using my own money as the prize. Elena stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of professional medical observation. I've been documenting inconsistencies in Mrs. Sullivan's supposed symptoms for months. Her responses were too precise, too controlled for genuine cognitive decline. She was performing dementia, not experiencing it. David's desperation exploded into rage. "You lying bitch!" He lunged toward Margaret's wheelchair, but Sarah and Dr. Wright intercepted him before he could reach her. "Mr. Sullivan, you need to step back." Sarah's voice carried legal authority. "This conversation is being recorded for potential criminal proceedings." "Criminal proceedings?" David's laugh was bitter and sharp. "She's the one who's been committing fraud. 18 months of lying about her mental condition, manipulating medical professionals, deceiving whom?" Margaret's voice cut through his accusations like ice. "David, I was protecting myself from you. From a son who saw his mother's illness as an opportunity for theft. From a gambling addict who was willing to destroy everything I built to cover his own failures." Rose Chen appeared in the doorway, her presence adding the weight of legal expertise to the proceedings. "Mrs. Sullivan, as your neighbor and as a retired attorney, I've been documenting the family dynamics I observed. Your son's behavior has been consistent with financial exploitation, not medical care." She produced her own notebook, filled with detailed observations. "David Sullivan has exhibited the classic patterns of someone systematically isolating a vulnerable adult while positioning himself for financial gain. The supposed medical symptoms never manifested in neutral settings when family members weren't present." Dr. Wright cleared his throat, his professional composure returning as he processed the implications. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need to ask directly. Have you been deliberately misleading medical professionals about your cognitive status?" Margaret met his gaze squarely. "Doctor, I have been protecting myself from medical interventions that would have made me genuinely helpless. David requested antipsychotic medications to manage behavioral problems that never existed. Those drugs would have clouded my mind and made his theft legally defensible." She held up more documents from her hidden collection. "I also have recordings of David threatening Elena when she asked too many questions, and evidence of him pressuring you to provide documentation supporting incompetency proceedings." Sarah stepped forward with official authority. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need to inform you that deliberately deceiving medical professionals is a serious matter. However, given the evidence of financial exploitation and potential elder abuse, we'll need to conduct a full investigation of all parties involved." Jennifer's voice interrupted from the doorway, where she'd been listening with growing amazement. "Mom, you've been aware this whole time?" Margaret's expression softened as she looked at her daughter. "Jennifer, you were the one person I wanted to tell. When you started investigating David's financial management, I was so proud of you for finally standing up to him. But why didn't you trust me?" Jennifer's voice carried hurt beneath the relief. "Because I wasn't sure you'd believe me," Margaret replied honestly. "And because I needed evidence that would hold up in court. David has been very careful to present himself as the devoted son managing his mother's care. My word alone wouldn't have been enough." Tommy stepped forward, his young face carrying a maturity beyond his years. "Grandma, what happens now?" Margaret looked around the room at the faces watching her, some with admiration, some with shock, some with the calculating expression of people reassessing everything they thought they knew. "Now," Margaret said with the quiet authority of someone who had spent 18 months planning for this moment, "we make sure that financial elder abuse has consequences, that families can't prey on their own members, and that Margaret Sullivan reclaims not just her voice, but her rightful place as someone who refuses to be invisible." David stood in the corner, his face pale with the realization that his carefully constructed narrative had crumbled completely. The son who had counted his mother's money before she was dead now faced the prospect of criminal charges and civil liability. Margaret Sullivan had spent 18 months being underestimated, dismissed, and written off as irrelevant. Now, in a room full of witnesses and with evidence that could destroy David's life as thoroughly as he'd tried to destroy hers, she was ready to show him exactly how dangerous it was to assume that silence meant consent. The performance was over. The reckoning was just beginning. 6 months after Margaret Sullivan reclaimed her voice in that crowded room at Willowbrook Manor, she sat in the same wheelchair. Not because she needed it, but because she'd chosen to keep it as a reminder of what survival sometimes required. The morning sun streamed through the windows of her new corner suite, where she'd insisted on remaining despite Jennifer's repeated offers to move her back to her own home. "Some battles are worth fighting from the ground you've already claimed," Margaret had explained to her daughter, and Jennifer had finally understood that Willowbrook Manor had become more than just Margaret's hiding place. It had become the fortress from which she'd launched her counterattack. The legal proceedings had unfolded with the methodical precision Margaret had anticipated. David's theft of $3.7 million had been documented down to the last cent, his forged authorizations exposed through handwriting analysis, and his attempts to medicate her into genuine incompetence revealed through Elena's meticulous testimony. The Meridian Group's connections to organized crime had provided federal prosecutors with additional charges that ensured David would spend the next 8 to 12 years in prison. But the criminal justice system had been only the beginning of Margaret's restoration. "Mrs. Sullivan?" Elena's voice interrupted her morning reflections. The nurse, now promoted to Director of Patient Advocacy at Willowbrook Manor, entered with her characteristic blend of professional competence and genuine warmth. "Your 10 o'clock appointment is here." Margaret smiled at the woman who had risked her career to protect a patient she barely knew. Elena's promotion had been Margaret's first official act as the facility's newest board member, a position she'd claimed using her restored legal authority and the leverage that came with being the target of institutional negligence. "Send him in," Margaret replied, straightening her silk blouse and adjusting the pearls that had once been locked away in David's safekeeping. She'd reclaimed not just her voice and her money, but the dignity that came with choosing her own appearance. The visitor was James Morrison, a middle-aged man whose nervous energy reminded Margaret of herself during her early business negotiations. He represented the third family that month, seeking her help with suspected elder abuse cases. "Mrs. Sullivan," James began, settling into the chair that had once held so many conspirators against her welfare, "my mother's been acting strange since she moved in with my brother. The financial decisions, the sudden changes to her will, but she insists everything's fine, and legally we can't." "Legally, you can do more than you think," Margaret interrupted gently. "But first, tell me about your mother's behavior when your brother isn't present. The details matter more than you realize." Over the past 6 months, Margaret had quietly established what Rose Chen had dubbed the Sullivan Foundation for Elder Rights, an organization that combined legal advocacy with investigative support for families navigating suspected abuse. Rose served as chief legal counsel, bringing 4 decades of civil rights expertise to bear on cases that traditional law enforcement often overlooked. "The key," Margaret continued, "is documentation. Not just financial records, but behavioral patterns, medical inconsistencies, and witness testimony from neutral parties. My case succeeded because I had allies who were willing to see what family members might miss or dismiss." As James took notes with the desperate attention of someone drowning in bureaucracy, Margaret reflected on how much had changed since her revelation. Tommy had become her unofficial research assistant, his technological skills and youthful energy perfect for investigating complex financial schemes. His history reports now focused on corporate fraud and forensic accounting, and Margaret had quietly arranged for internships that would guide him toward a career in financial crimes investigation. Jennifer had surprised everyone by leaving her corporate law practice to join the district attorney's office as a specialist in elder abuse prosecution. "I spent too many years ignoring what was happening in my own family," she'd told Margaret. "I won't make that mistake again." Their relationship had required careful reconstruction, built on Jennifer's painful acknowledgement of her complicity through inaction and Margaret's understanding that her daughter's failure to see hadn't been malicious, just tragically human. "Mrs. Sullivan," James continued, "my brother says our mother's confusion is getting worse, but when I called her yesterday she remembered details about stock prices from 30 years ago. Perfectly accurate details that I had to verify online." Margaret nodded knowingly. Selective memory is often the first sign. Someone with genuine cognitive decline doesn't retain complex financial information while forgetting basic personal care needs. "What you're describing sounds like someone who's very aware but very frightened." After James left with a detailed action plan and contact information for Rose's legal team, Margaret wheeled herself to the window overlooking Willowbrook Manor's gardens. The facility had undergone significant changes since her revelation. New oversight protocols, mandatory staff training on elder abuse recognition, and an ombudsman program that gave residents direct access to legal advocacy. Elena had joked that Margaret's 18 months of careful observation had produced a more comprehensive reform agenda than most regulatory inspections. And she wasn't wrong. Margaret's insider knowledge of institutional vulnerabilities had become the blueprint for protecting other residents from the exploitation she'd endured. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Tommy entered carrying his laptop and the focused expression that meant he'd discovered something important in his latest research project. "Grandma, I found 3 more cases that match the David pattern," he announced, settling into their usual consultation arrangement. Adult children with gambling debts, elderly parents with recent cognitive diagnoses, and financial irregularities that preceded the medical symptoms. Margaret smiled at her grandson's investigative instincts. "Show me the details." As Tommy outlined his findings with the precision of a seasoned analyst, Margaret felt the deep satisfaction of purpose fulfilled. She'd survived David's betrayal, but more importantly, she'd transformed that survival into something larger, a system for protecting others from the isolation and exploitation that could have destroyed her. The irony wasn't lost on her that becoming invisible had taught her how to see clearly, and that losing her voice had shown her how to speak with authority that couldn't be dismissed or medicated away. Rose Chen appeared in the doorway, her sharp eyes carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd just won an important legal victory. "Margaret, the Henderson case settled. Full restitution plus punitive damages. That's 12 families we've helped recover stolen assets this year." 13, Tommy corrected, looking up from his laptop. "The Morrison case is going to be number 13. Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of accomplishment settle around her like the silk scarves she'd once worn to board meetings. She'd built one empire through construction and development. Now she was building another through deconstruction, tearing down the systems that allowed families to prey on their most vulnerable members. "You know," Rose observed, settling into the chair that had once held so many threats to Margaret's welfare, "when I first moved in here, I thought this place would be where I came to fade away quietly. Instead, it's become the headquarters for the most effective elder rights organization on the West Coast." Margaret laughed, the sound carrying none of the bitter edge that had marked her earlier months of hidden observation. "Rose, I spent 40 years building things people could see and measure. Turns out the most important construction project was the one nobody saw coming." Outside her window, the afternoon shift change brought Elena's team to their rounds. Staff members who now understood that every patient was someone's mother, father, or grandparent, deserving of dignity regardless of their apparent capacity to demand it. Margaret Sullivan had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was disappear completely, but only if you were prepared to return stronger than anyone expected. She'd spent 18 months being underestimated, and now she was using that experience to ensure that other voices wouldn't be silenced by assumption, greed, or family betrayal. The performance was over. The real work had begun. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,